Wer glaubt, wird selig. Der Studio Omega Religionspodcast.
Welcome to a new episode of Wer glaubt, wird selig, der Studio Omega Religionspodcast, says Udo Seelofer. In our podcast, we accompany people on their journey of life and faith. Today we talk to David Patterson, Chair of Holocaust Studies at the University of Dallas, Texas. I met with him online and asked him about the situation at his university with pro-Hamas demonstrations and why Hamas-Propaganda is so effective in the West. We also talk about the shared history of Western anti-Semitism and that in the Middle East and what needs to be done now to support Jewish citizens.
We keep hearing about pro-Palestine protests at the American universities in the media. What is the situation at your university at the moment?
Well, at my university, we have had demonstrations. They say pro-Palestinian, but of course, in the year 2024, pro-Palestinian is pro-Hamas. Just like in 1942, pro-German, it was pro-Nazi. So we have demonstrations where I am. I'm at the University of Texas at Dallas. We've had students and non-students arrested. We've had 3 professors arrested who are participating in these demonstrations. The demonstrations are driven by a kind of an unabashed Jew hatred. I mean, you hear calls of, death to the Zionists, and Zionists meaning Jews. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Yeah. Free of what? Free of the Jews. What else that freedom might look like? They don't know. They can't say. You see in academia a real, what we call a red-green alliance, that the intellectual left is aligned with the jihadist fanatic, certainly on the subject of Israel, Jewish state, Jews, and Judaism. It's not just Israelis, it's Jews everywhere who are under attack here.
We have these demonstrations here in Vienna on a weekly basis too. And I was always wondering, when I see those people, I remember one picture, a woman who was holding a sign who had the slogan, "No God, no state, no patriarchy, and free Palestine" on one sign. And I thought, that's completely not what you're going to get with Hamas. How does this propaganda catch on so well in the West?
That's an excellent question. I think anti-Semitism is driven by a desire to be God, to either get rid of God or to appropriate God. The left-wing atheist mindset, no God, would eliminate God. Of course, when I eliminate God, I become like God myself. The Hamas jihadists appropriate God. They presume to speak for God. In their charter, the Hamas charter, the Hamas covenant is called the covenant of Allah. So Hamas is Allah. Hezbollah is the party of Allah. Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, says that Hezbollah is the clearinghouse for all humanity. In other words, Hezbollah, Hamas, jihadists decide who is redeemed and who is damned. And you see this element of redemption, this drive for purity, and purity of blood, purity of thought, purity of doctrine, and in anti-Semitic movements. The Nazis wanted to make Europe Judenrein, purified, cleansed of the Jews. And the jihadists use the same discourse. In fact, there are connections between the Nazis and the jihadist movement. Muslim Brotherhood, Haj Amin al-Husseini was a Nazi war criminal. Al-Husseini has direct connections to the Brotherhood, and Hamas, of course, identifies itself as part of the Muslim Brotherhood.
That leads me directly to my next question. So what is the common history between your Western anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism in the Middle East?
The history goes back to what's called, the beginnings of the colonial period, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, when Europeans were moving into the Middle East, and they brought with them many of the Christian anti-Semitic prejudices. I mean, things like the blood libel, Jews kill Gentile children and use their blood to make matzah, or they drink their blood. The World Jewish Conspiracy Protocol from Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this anti-Semitic diatribe published in Russia in 1903. That was first translated into Arabic in 1926. So they import the tropes and the themes of anti-Semitism from Europe. But of course, Islam itself has a history of anti-Semitism of its own. Now, in the 20th century, it's the connection between Nazis and jihadists solidifies in the 20th century, particularly through, as I mentioned, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Al-Husseini was the Mufti of Jerusalem under the British Mandate. He was appointed Mufti in 1922 in an effort to appease the Arab population in Palestine. When the new German consul was set up in 1933 from under the Nazi rule, he had his first meeting with Heinrich Wolf, who was the Nazi representative in Jerusalem. And the Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood, sent delegations to the Nuremberg rallies in the 30s. So the connections between the Brotherhood was founded in 1928, and the Nazis, between Hajj Amin al-Husseini and the Nazis, was very tight. When al-Husseini had to flee Palestine for inciting riots, he fled Palestine in 1937, went to Iraq, where he led a coup against the British-controlled government on behalf of which is funded by the Nazis. The British, overcame that attempt to overthrow them, and al-Husseini was on the run again. So November 28th, 1941, he had his first meeting with Hitler in Berlin. He went on to form Nazi killing units, consisting of Muslims. The Handschar division was the most famous in the Balkans. So the most jihadist movements in the world, particularly Hamas, stem from the Muslim Brotherhood and the ideology that you get from Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the founder, Hassan al-Banna, and certainly Sayyid Qutb, a very, very influential Muslim Brotherhood thinker. And they all are famous for diatribes against the Jew. And it's not about occupying territory. It's not about the so-called occupation.
It's basically about destroying Jews.
It's destroying Jews, destroying what the Jews represent, namely, the millennial testimony that stems from the Torah, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the covenant of Abraham. That's what is being targeted and demonized. One of the sheikhs in Cairo, named Muhammad Hussein Yaqub, in 2009, said that we would hate the Jews if they didn't occupy a thing. We are commanded to hate them. Hajj Amin al-Husseini says that killing Jews is a holy act, pleasing to Allah. Whoever kills a Jew has a guaranteed place in paradise. So the premise, you see, for the jihadists or the left-wing anti-Semites, the right-wing anti-Semites, the premise is not that all Jews are evil. The premise is all evil is Jewish. So to redeem humanity, to save the world, to purify the body politic, whatever your aim is, to get into paradise, you have to obliterate evil. And evil is embodied in, der ewige Jude, the eternal Jew. So it has a certain metaphysics attached to it. First principles that they proceed from.
Always thought that we as a society, we should be much further than this. And to be honest, I'm not only mad at people who say this, I'm also baffled that this is still around. So what can we do against it?
I study Holocaust, I study anti-Semitism, and I have done so for decades. And even I am shocked by the wave of unmitigated hatred that's sweeping the planet. Where I live in the U.S., it's palpable. You can feel it. It's in the air. It is mind-boggling, as you say. There's an evil in the heart that's been unleashed on the part of many people. It's been legitimized. Hate. Once you identify the Jews as the source of evil, then you have a moral obligation to get rid of them. or religious obligation. And again, I think it unleashes kind of this ancient temptation in each of us is to be like God by getting rid of God's witnesses. And so I become God. The first temptation, you eat this fruit and you will be like God, from the serpent. I think anti-Semitism is rooted in succumbing to that original temptation to kill God, get rid of God. I mean, and you see it projected on the Jews as the Jews are deicides, right? They're the God killers, as an old Christian, or they kill children. And much of the propaganda images, the visual propaganda from the jihadist world, you'll see, a Jew often victimizing a child or children, or you'll see a baby carriage in there somewhere. It's a recurring motif. So the Jews are the murderers of holiness, so to say. I think there's an anti-Semite inside of all of us, and just like there's a saint in each of us, right? There's a Messiah in each of us. But I think it's unleashed because on the far left, it's become with the professors, they legitimize it. If the professors want to see the Jewish state annihilated, then it must be okay for me to take that view. In many academic circles, and I live in academia, you cannot be considered a moral person if you support the existence of a Jewish state, not the policy, the existence.
Yeah, I think that's a very important difference, because many people say they can criticize Israel, but they forget that those people, they don't want Israel to exist at all.
That's correct. It's not, many Israelis are very critical of the government, right? I mean, Israel itself is divided. Many Jews are very critical of the current government in Israel. Okay. But the basis of criticizing the government, at least for many, is that this government is itself threatening the existence of Israel. So it's for the sake of preserving Israel as a Jewish state that this criticism is invoked. Whereas, I'm sure you're familiar with the boycott, divest, sanction movement, the BDS movement, as it's called here in the U.S.
Yeah, I know it is.
The founder, Omar Barghouti, said that the ultimate aim of this movement is the destruction of the Jewish state. They're not trying to get the Israeli government to change its policy, right?
But that would be reasonable somewhat.
Well, you can make a reasoned argument to that effect. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
We just talked about how this propaganda catches on so well. Is there anything we can do to prevent it, or at least make it slower?
Make it slower? That's a good question. Yeah, I like that. Can we at least slow it down? It's like a cancer that's spreading. Can we slow it down somehow?
Yeah. What would be the right therapy?
I would have said education, but I'm not sure education will work, because education right now is part of the problem, that, our students are being indoctrinated by openly anti-Zionist and thinkers, professors. And where anti-Zionist is, as I just mentioned, is an opposition to the existence of the Jewish state, not the policies. So, I do my small part. I teach in a university. I teach, courses I just did a seminar on anti-Semitism. And interestingly, it was a graduate seminar. And in my, seminar room, with about 14, 15, PhD students, there's a pro-Hamas demonstration out the window outside. We could see it. So this is kind of this graphic demonstration of what we were talking about in the seminar. And in my experience, when students become better informed, they are better able to come to a reasonable conclusion. But they're not so much informed in many quarters as they are indoctrinated. And indoctrination is the opposite of education.
What do you mean indoctrinate? What do you mean with indoctrination exactly in that regard?
They're handed ready answers and fixed formulas, which leads them not to be open to questioning or discussion. For example, Israel is an apartheid state. That's axiomatic. And if you press these professors, when I press them, well, what do you mean? What makes it apartheid state? Can you explain? There's no explanation, no definition. In other words, Israel is an evil state. I mean, what is the moral requirement when you're faced with an apartheid state? It has to be dismantled. Israel is a colonialist state. Well, what does that mean exactly? Is it like Great Britain? The Commonwealth where the sun never set on the British Empire? Are the Jews in Israel like the British in India? Were the British returning to their ancient homeland in India? No. Were they fleeing for their lives? No. Most of the Jews, if they weren't born there in Israel, have fled to Israel, sought refuge in Israel. That's not colonialism. But I know people who think if you ask, well, what makes it colonialism? They don't know what to say. They don't have an answer. That's the creed. There's a creed. There's a catechism.
Yeah. So that's basically just something that they got told and they believe it.
Yes, and they were not allowed to question it, to say why.
How are these professors even allowed to teach that? I mean,
Boy, is that
freedom of science, but
well, they invoke freedom of speech, but as I said, education encourages questioning. Indoctrination discourages questioning. I think one of the things that drives Jew hatred is that Judaism is a tradition of what we call machlok, disputation, argument, questioning, challenging the Torah itself, the authority. Whether you are, radical left, communist, or fanatic jihadist, questioning is not tolerated. Challenging authority is not tolerated. Right? I have many students. I have Muslim students and Christian students and students who don't believe in anything. But I can tell you, among the Muslim and Christian students, they're very surprised to find that in Judaism, we encourage questioning God himself. God's first conversation with Abraham after sealing the covenant is Abraham questioning him over Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Challenging God. Will the judge of the world be unjust?
How do your students react to that new experience in questioning God?
It's a strange notion to many of them, but for many of them, they like it. It's not about rebelling against God. It's understanding ourselves to be in a covenant with God. It's not a master-slave relation. It's more like a marriage, right? Where you in the marriage, your wife is supposed to oppose you when you need some opposition. Right?
That's absolutely true. Yes, of course.
So in a covenantal relation, you can interact and not just react.
How do the events in the Middle East now, the whole situation in Gaza, influence anti-Semitism here in the West?
I think it was the match that lit the gasoline in the West when on October 7th, Hamas themselves, the terrorists themselves, videoed what they were doing and posted it and circulated it. And a rational, normal person might think, well, the world is going to be horrified by this. And many were, of course. I can't even watch it myself. But many were incited to more hatred by it. The world's reaction to what is happening in Gaza is I would say, tainted with anti-Semitism, even the American reaction. Just the discourse. You hear very little in the way of pressuring Hamas to release hostages. The pressure is on the Israelis to cease fire. The word cease fire means Israelis should cease fire, not Hamas should cease fire. The fighting could stop today if Hamas just, laid down its weapons and released the hostages. It would be over. There would be no more killing anybody. So the pressure is on Israel as if Israel were the bad guys. I mean, look what's happening with the International Criminal Court, the ICC. It's a disgrace, and that they would hold the Israelis to the same sort of accountability as they would hold Hamas. I mean, the moral compass is just spinning out of control. It's gone.
Why is that so? Why in this case now?
Well, this is where you have kind of an ultimate confrontation between good and evil. I would say between good and evil. I think, Hamas, I would say the actions of Hamas are evil. And part of the evil is to demonize the good and dehumanize the Israelis in this case. So why in this case? This is in the heart of the Holy Land, so to say. Not far. It's not far from Jerusalem. It's between the Jews and those who would replace the Jews, Islam. I think what is not talked about much is the religious dimension of this. I'm not sure everyone knows that Hamas, they identify as Muslim. They might somehow know that, but what does that mean? What does that mean to identify as a Muslim? What does it mean when Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, who was assassinated, says that killing Jews is an act of devotion to God? It becomes extreme because it's about the ultimate holiness, evil, testimony to the Holy One. It's a collision. I mean, you might wonder why the world is generally silent about the millions who have been slaughtered in Africa, mainly by jihadists. In fact, in the last 10 years, someone is on the order of like 10 million people. And and yet the world is focused on Gaza.
Where does this fixation come from?
I think it comes from a fixation, as I said earlier, on God and getting rid of God. The first question put to the first human is, where are you? And it's God who asks. The questions put to Cain, the first murderer who killed his brother Abel, was, where's your brother and what have you done? Again, it's God who asks. We don't want to be asked. This is about the life of the Holy One in this realm and the assault on that presence and the testimony to that presence. And it's not a question, well, you might say, well, not everybody believes in God. It doesn't matter. You have the ideas, the consciousness at work. You don't have to believe in God to say that God plays a role in the thinking, in the conflict. It's about God. Whether you believe in God or not, they believe in God, and they take it very seriously. Part of our problem in the West in understanding this is that religion doesn't play much of a role in the American society or Western Europe as it compared to these Muslim countries. Religion is everywhere.
Yeah, it's even everywhere here, and we are not as religious anymore as we used to be. So
yes, yeah,
that play a part in people's lives.
It is. It's the Hamas. It's the sum of religious life. It's the religion. There's no separating your life from the religion.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main differences between extremists and average people. For an average person, it can be a part of his life, but not the sum of everything he does and thinks.
Yeah, and as for the Jews, I would say at least half of the Israelis are not religious. A lot of them have a synagogue that they don't go to.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
I know many Christians or Muslims that are not very religious too, so maybe they should all join together.
That's true, but the Jews are stuck with being the people of the covenant, at least in much of the world. Going back to Moses, the Bible has a huge impact on the consciousness of much of humanity. So the Jews can't be separated from the Bible, from God. The so-called chosen. But chosen is often misunderstood. Chosen means assigned. The Jews have an assignment, and their assignment is to say to the world, every human being is chosen. Every human being is assigned to a task that no one else can perform and bears an infinite responsibility for that task, because the task is to preserve, take care of something that's infinitely precious. The life of another person. It's a burden, or it can feel like a burden to have this responsibility. I think part of anti-Semitism and wanting to be like God is to have no responsibility. to have my ledger cleared. My debts are erased. The accounts are settled. The Jewish teaching suggests that not only are the accounts never settled, but the debt increases in the measure that it's paid. In other words, we grow more responsible with every response. So it can be overwhelming. Now, and I think everything happening in Israel and Gaza brings to bear these ancient forces that affect the life of the soul, the life of the mind, sense of security or insecurity, vulnerability, protection. It's the big questions are being worked out right now in Israel, in Gaza, and the collisions are terrible.
When you look at what is currently happening and the terrible collisions, as you just said, aren't you afraid that this will lead to more hatred and more bloodshed in the long run?
I am afraid. I think it's already, the discourse is already spreading everywhere. The discourse of hatred, demonizing, dehumanizing, and violence is always preceded by words. I mean, the Nazis are a classic example, but they're not the only example. The discourse is calculated, as I said, to demonize and dehumanize the Jews. Just like, if you've seen, I'm sure you've seen the image of, the David Patterson from Nazi propaganda.
Yes.
It looks like a devil, right? It doesn't look like a person.
It looks like a demon. Yes.
Yeah. And once you demonize somebody, Jews or anyone, you dehumanize them and you legitimize violence toward them. In fact, you make their elimination a moral demand. They can't be a victim. And notice how from many directions, the victims of October 7th are denied their victimhood. I know the women's movements, at least in much of the West, are very silent about the horrific rape cases that you see from that time and from the rape of the hostages. I mean, hostages who have been released have testified to this. I saw there's a professor of women's studies at University of Minnesota who insists that there's no evidence of any rape. And to accuse the Palestinians, as she said, to accuse the Palestinians of rape is racist. So if you are evil, you can't be a victim. And you can't be victimized. So this is there's a form of a 10-7 denial, you might say.
I remember I read a very good article about it. I can't remember by whom now, but the tagline stuck with me because the tagline was "Me too, unless you're a Jew."
Yes, I saw that. Yes.
Yeah.
That's it. That's it. Yeah.
What can we do as a society to support Jewish citizens in this situation?
Well, that is an excellent question. First of all, I think we have to name the evil. If we don't name it, we can't see it. One of the major student organizations here is the Students for Justice in Palestine, and they're funded by the Muslim Brotherhood, among others, and they are evil. They are anti-Semitic. They are opposed to the existence of the Jewish state. So we have to name the evil. They're not rallying for freedom or justice. It's the opposite. So we have to name the evil. The Jews need help, but it's dangerous. It's always dangerous to stand with the Jews. It's dangerous. Among my students, I have Jewish students who are afraid. They're afraid to be on the campus. They're afraid to go to class. At least one of them has been physically assaulted. Several others have had people spit on them. They are, harassed, intimidated, and so on. But they're the Jewish students, but they have friends. Their friends are also intimidated. They're also afraid. So it requires courage to stand with the Jews, because you might get in the line of fire. Here in the universities, if you're a professor and you are a supporter of Israel, you can lose your job in some places. someone like me, I'm very senior and advanced in my career, so I don't run any risk when I speak up. But my younger colleagues have to be careful what they say with regard to Israel, with regard to supporting Israel.
Doesn't this make you angry?
Yes. And I'm very vocal about it with the higher administration. They would, they're just waiting for me to fade away, I'm sure. But yes, it's infuriating. Most of my students are PhD students getting their doctorate degrees, and most of them will go into academia. And part of what I have to teach them is how to navigate these waters and what to say, when to speak and when to be silent. Because, as you know, early in their careers, they're extremely vulnerable. Without tenure, if you anger the wrong person, So what is really frightening is how the discourse of Jew hatred has been legitimized. And once it's legitimized, once it more and more mainstream, then violence toward the Jews becomes more and more likely. And what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jew. Anti-Semitism is not just Jew hatred, it's hatred of the other human being. Anti-Semitism is not a form of racism. Racism is a form of anti-Semitism. In other words, you have to establish an anti-Judaic premise in order to arrive at a racist outlook. In Jewish tradition, what do I mean by that? According to Jewish teaching, and not just Jewish, but the Bible, according to the Bible, every human being is infinitely precious and spiritually and physically connected to every other human being. Each is a child of God, created in the image of God, and each is a child of Adam. The Hebrew word for human being is Ben Adam, which means a child of Adam. We're all connected. And the sages ask, why does God begin with just one and not two? I mean, at some point you have to have two. And the answer is so that nobody could say my side of the family is better than your side of the family. There's only one side. So you can see how this is fundamentally anti-racist. We're all related. We're blood relatives. So you have to eliminate that way of thinking in order to arrive at a racist outlook. Anti-Semitism is it's about a radical disconnection between one person and another. Judaism is about a radical connection that each of us has to every other. So once the disconnect goes far enough, then violence follows. But not, as I said, not just violence toward the Jews. Violence itself is legitimized. Yeah, non-Jews have a good reason to stand with the Jews because they're coming for non-Jews too. Look at the woke culture, wokeism, as we call it in America.
I know.
Where there's, so I mean, anyone can be canceled if they're not towing the party line. Wokeism does not tolerate argument, questioning, challenging. So anti-Semitism is a human matter. It's about humanity.
Do you see any possibility that all the religions, be it Muslims, Jews, Christians, can reach a point where all of this hatred is going to end one day, especially now with the situation in the Middle East?
Will it ever end? I don't know. I mean, the Jewish tradition teaches that it won't end until the Messiah comes.
Maybe we should be patient, huh?
Well, yes, but we're also required to work for the coming of the Messiah. We're also required to through our acts of loving kindness to make it possible for the Messiah to enter. That's one of the defining features of the Messiah in Jewish teaching, is that the Messiah will open our hearts and our eyes to loving kindness for one another. It's not that the Messiah comes to save our soul. The Messiah comes to help us save one another through loving kindness. Now, the most religious traditions do have texts and teachings that they can turn to. For example, during the Crusades, when Crusaders were killing Jews and Muslims, killing Jews in Europe and Palestine and Muslims in Palestine, you could be a Christian and object to it. Right. You could say we're going too far. We shouldn't be, and then point to your own teaching. But there are strains, lines of thinking, teaching in Christianity, like, the order of the Knights. There are certainly in Islam, where the Ayatollah Khomeini says that all glory that's ever come to Islam has come through the sword. There are elements of those traditions that glorify violence. In Jewish tradition, violence is a matter of shame. If you have to resort to violence, it's a source of shame. When the temple stood, when Israelites went into a battle and returned, they had to bring a sin offering to the temple, because fighting, even when it looks like it's necessary, is a sin, is a bad thing. It's never a good thing. You remember, Golda Meir. There's a famous line from Golda Meir after the October 73 war, the Yom Kippur War. She said to the Arab countries that they fought, she said, "We can forgive you for attacking us. We can even forgive you for killing our children. But we will never forgive you for making our children kill your children." So you see that there's got to be a shift in how we view violence. And in many parts of the world, and including in religious traditions, violence is glorified.
I think that was a very good statement to end our interview. Professor Patterson, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Udo. Thank you so much. Be safe, be well. All blessings to you and your family.
Thank you. You too. Thank you.
That was Wer glaubt wird selig, der Studio Omega Religionspodcast for today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please recommend us and tell your friends and family about us. We would also be delighted if you would give us a good rating on the podcast app of your choice and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter or YouTube. Then all that remains is for me to say goodbye. Goodbye and see you next time, says Udo Seelofer.